Welcome to the AD Claude podcast series with Social Impact Founders, an initiative by the Ashank Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development at IIM Ahmedabad, where we document and celebrate the leadership journeys of India's homegrown social entrepreneurs who have built impactful institutions from the ground up. In today's episode, we have the privilege of speaking with Shaheen Mistry, one of India's most enduring and visionary education leaders. Born in Mumbai, Shaheen grew up across 13 countries and at the age of 18 returned to the city and walked into the slums of Mumbai with a single question: why can't every child be as lucky as I have been? The question became Akanksha, which was founded in 1989 with 15 children and a group of college friends, which has grown into a network of 26 schools across Mumbai, Pune and Nagpur, reaching over 14,000 children today. Nearly 2 decades later, inspired by the Teach for America model and her meeting with Wendy Kopp, Shaheen co-founded Teach for India in 2008, with the audacious vision of providing an excellent education to every child in India. Today, Teach for India places over 1,000 fellows across 8 cities, directly impacts 34,000 children, and has built an alumni community of over 4,600 members who are collectively reaching 50 million children indirectly. Shaheen is an Ashoka Fellow, a World Economic Forum Global Leader for Tomorrow, and an Asia Society 21 leader. She's an author of Redrawing India and has spoken at platforms across the world from Davos to Delhi on educational equity, leadership, and transformative power of a child seen not as a problem to be fixed, but as a partner in change. Shaheen, welcome to our podcast. It's a true honor to have you here.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much. Shaheen, maybe we could start with you giving us a picture of what Teach for India looks like today, the scale, cities you operate, the nature of your fellows and staff, alumni community, and how the organization is funded at this point of time.
Sure, happy to. So Teach for India is a movement for educational equity. So our big focus is building a movement of leaders who will work at all levels of the system towards that singular goal of educational equity. Today, as you mentioned, we now have, I think, 1,200 fellows currently teaching this year. So we brought in our largest cohort this year of 720 incoming fellows who are all in training. They teach across 8 cities, and we've just launched our 9th city where we'll start teaching in Gurgaon this year as well. So they teach across about 300 schools. The fellowship is a 2-year, very intense, full-time teaching experience where you learn leadership in the classroom. And then we have 5,800 alumni of the program, 70% of whom have stayed full-time in the social sector, working for children at all different levels of the system. Additionally, we also have what we call our movement building programs. So we have an online teacher training program, which is open, free for any teacher across India, called Firki. We have a student leadership movement called the Kids Education Revolution that brings kids together from across the world, actually, to reimagine education alongside their educators. And we have a program called TFIX, where we support entrepreneurs in some of the most remote parts of India to set up their own versions of Teach for India, their own organizations, but with that same idea of building local leadership pipelines. So collectively, that's sort of where we are. All of us together as a movement are aimed at North Star of saying, can we build a movement of 50,000 leaders by 2032 who will transform the lives of 1 in 10 children in the regions we serve from lower income backgrounds.
So when you say you have the alumni, 4,800 of them working in this, these are all your past fellows?
Yes. So 5,800 alumni who've completed the 2-year fellowship and now work across the country in different forms.
I see. I see. Okay. And so these are, in a way, you are also preparing the workforce for working in social sector.
Absolutely. That's really the core idea.
Correct.
And that's where the multiplier is. Like during the
Yes.
fellowship, they will teach for 2 years one group of kids. But then as alumni, they work at scale, they work with governments, they run schools. So that's where you really see the multiplier.
Absolutely.
Additionally, we have 16,000 student alumni that have graduated from our classrooms.
Okay.
Some of them also entering the sector and working for educational equity. In fact, we've crossed 100 of our own children who have made the fellowship selection bar and come in and become Teach for India fellows.
I see. Okay. And so to be a fellow, you have to be a graduate, or is that what it? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So our fellows are either graduates from college across different streams, or they're actually young professionals that have worked for a few years and feel they want to do something different, change their career, come into the social sector.
I see. Okay. And how do you fund most of this work? Like, what's the source of funding for this?
All of the work is funded through donations. So that's a big part of what my wonderful development team does, is they spend the whole year raising funds. A large part of that comes from CSR, but then a good amount comes from foundations, from individuals as well.
I see. Okay. And have you at some point felt that, that itself is a burden, that you have to constantly look for money, or is that something that is part of who you are?
I feel very lucky to have a really wonderful team and a very stable team that carries a lot of the load of fundraising, and an extremely active and supportive board, both at the national level, but then we also have regional boards in all of our cities. So it really is a collective effort, fundraising. It is a very big and ongoing effort. So one can never be comfortable. But at the same time, I think the movement and we've just got a lot of friends and supporters over the years who care about the work. So we've been very lucky to be able to do the work that we can do because of the funding we're able to secure. But it is ongoing work, and there's also a big lag time often between when you start the conversation and when the money comes in. So it really is just constant work in progress.
Sure. And some of your funders, long-term funders, or is it a year-on-year?
Most of them do make a long-term commitment, but have sort of yearly metrics. So it's never 100% guaranteed that you'll get the intention is long-term, but then you still have to meet the particular goals with a lot of them year on year to secure the funding.
And is that somewhat, how do you see that? Because sometimes, some of these things are not in year on year. They take a long time. The changes take a long time. So how do you see that? How do you see that tension?
Honestly, I do think that is one of the things that I wish funders could discuss and debate and find a way around. I understand their limitations because their reporting mechanisms are also set up year on year. But as you said, this is not work that becomes visible necessarily every 6 months or every year. And sometimes because one needs to show that work, the investments in the longer term or the more invisible become harder to do because you don't have the funding for them. So I think we're lucky that with many of our donors, there is active conversation, partnership, relationships over multiple years. And so we have some who are very understanding of this, and others who are more constrained by their own limitations or may not have the decision-making authority themselves to bend on something like that. But it is a big challenge in the sector overall, I would say.
And do you, are there ways in which organizations like yours are able to apportion funding in such a way that some of it can actually be put in for doing the patient work, and some of it can be for the urgent and the visible work at this point?
Yeah. So we are actively trying to strengthen and build our reserves. So, one is able to do that. I think the challenge though is that every year the work is growing so quickly and the budget itself is growing so much that to be able to raise that plus raise a reserve. I also think the most Indian funders don't like giving money for reserves. CSR, it's not possible through CSR. at all. And so it just is a more challenging conversation. Like, I think the concept is a little bit more normalized in the US and in other countries. In India, funders tend to want much more visibility into how the money is being spent in a shorter time frame. But that is something that would help the sector greatly if we could have a larger reserve.
Correct, right. So that also will require a mindset shift from the funders, even the organizations, because, maybe there is that, how you start to account for it and how you make sure that it's transparent. So those are things. Right. So one aspect of course, the one level of friction is your the funding, but the other one must be in my mind, the schools, right? Because there are the government systems also have their own methods and their own ways and how they want to do it. So how do you navigate some of that?
Yeah, I mean, my answer to everything actually comes down to just relationships. Because you're right, the way we teach is different from the existing system. There are 101 factors that come in the way of learning. That the school itself faces those challenges, and then we, by virtue of coming into these schools, face the same challenges. I think it really depends on the relationship and on the leadership of the leader of the school. If that person is more open, believes in a more holistic education, then they are able to navigate a lot of the challenges to make the environment more conducive for learning. And sometimes we found that and sometimes we haven't. So it really does depend on the people within the system. It also depends on the mindset of our fellows going in. So if our fellows go in very angry about some of the things that they see children face, which is natural when you're 22, 23 years old, some of the things we see on the ground are very difficult to see. That's not very helpful. When they go in with more of a lens of understanding the people in the system, building relationships, understanding that change is going to take time, that a lot of what they're seeing represents like decades of social conditioning. When they go in with a little bit more humility, a spirit of partnership, we're able to move faster.
So that must be part of your training as well to the fellows, right? How you condition compassion.
But it is difficult. Like, I remember myself as a 22-year-old. I was a very angry, impatient 22-year-old. So I feel them whenever they react like that. I can understand that.
And that anger is also towards a service, right? It's also
absolutely
real feeling for that. So it's not, we can't completely disown it either.
No, the anger brings them into the work as well.
Yes.
It keeps them in the work. So it's a question of how do you channel it in ways that are productive. It's just one of the things that I learned very slowly, or am learning, I would say more accurately, slowly over time, is that like partnership feels like a slower way to approach these pieces, but a more sustainable way to approach them as well.
Sure. In the beginning, you said that now you're just going to enter Gurgaon. So when you say you're going to go to Gurgaon, which means you have worked with the education, the district education, or how do you say that now we're going to go to Gurgaon? How does that work?
So basically, we place in two different types of schools. We place in government schools where usually we go to whoever the governing authority is, could be the municipal commissioner, for example, get permission, and then they place us in schools where there are vacancies and there is a need, so that we're not displacing teachers. And then we make a long-term commitment to those schools. Or we place in some of the lowest income private schools. So the kind of budget private schools that mushroom in low-income communities. Often infrastructure is significantly worse than in the government system. And there they are run by trusts. So there usually we need to meet each school or each trust one by one to get permission to place. But our problem now is the opposite. We're now not able to meet the demand because there's such a need on the ground for strong teachers. Yeah.
So have you, in the process of working with so many fellows and really understanding what happens in the classroom, have you been able to impact policy at the teacher training level or classroom interactions at the national level, or maybe even at the state level? Has that happened?
So really our theory of change is that Like, think of Teach for India, the organization, as one entity, and then the movement of our alumni, the wider umbrella. The organization ourselves, we don't do direct work in policy, but what we do is we spark the interest in fellows to go into policy.
I see.
So, for example, one of our staff alumni started a program in Chennai called Mati Foundation, and they are the district collector's partner for foundational literacy numeracy for the whole of Tamil Nadu. So they are working at scale.
I see.
Another one of our alumni was a Pune alum, Santosh More, started 3 organizations. The most recent one is a movement for educational equity called Shiksha Graha, where they've got 18 organizations and growing, coming together to work at a very large scale with a goal of impacting 1 million schools across the country. So we are seeing that happen, and we have a lot of our alumni working behind the scenes as well with government. So the answer is yes, but it's going to take time and it's indirect work.
So my sense is your stakeholders are the teachers, the schools that you go to, the fellows, your funders, and the last stakeholder would be your children.
Yeah,
the classrooms.
Yeah.
And how does that work? How's that?
Yeah. So I mean, I would say probably our first stakeholder is the child.
Yes.
In that, like, it's an interesting model because in the short term during the fellowship, the goal is for fellows to transform the lives of their students. And then in the long term as alumni, they're working with children at scale. So really the fellow is the leader impacting children in the short term and then in the long term as well. And we really take the responsibility for transforming our children's lives, not just academics, but also the life skills they need, the values that will make not just their own lives, but the lives of others better. We have a pretty broad definition of the purpose of education.
Very nice. Very nice. And just one last question about your organization. TFI, for example. So what's the size of the organization? The fellows and all that is separate, but the core organization?
We're about 300 people.
I see.
Including full-time people, full-time consultants. We also have a bank of interns that work with us. And this group of people run the fellowship, the movement building programs, and the whole back-end architecture needed to make this happen. Yeah.
And how is are these people, have they stayed on with you for a long time, or is there attrition? How do you keep them motivated?
I mean, all of the above is true. Our leadership team actually is fairly tenured, so we feel very grateful and thankful for that. Our fellowship, obviously the design of it is a 2 year. So every 2 years every year we have new fellows coming in. Attrition is a concern in the fellowship for sure. It's an extremely difficult fellowship experience, and however much we try to be transparent about what the challenges will be, until you're on the ground in one of these schools, you don't just sometimes realize it's not for you. So we do have a level of attrition there. We're also a fairly young organization in terms of the age of our staff members. So we do have a lot of people coming in for 3-4 years and then going on to do other things in the ecosystem. We actually feel okay about that in many of our roles because we see our people going on to contribute to the ecosystem in different ways as well.
But for a leader or for somebody who's managing all of this can be fairly stressful, right? So you're constantly training people, you're constantly bringing them up to. So how do how does that work?
I mean, I guess because the whole nature of our program is in 2-year cycles, the team has just got used to that. Like every year we run institute and we train people. So we have a lot of our trainings documented. I mean, every year they're tweaked, but there's a lot of resources that we've developed over these 17 years that helps. And then it's a little bit about culture, but I think we put a disproportionate amount of energy into building culture, talking about our values, creating spaces for our values, like hiring for values. So right through the life cycle of the staff member, values and culture, right down to like what is the culture needed in a classroom. These are all like explicit areas of focus for us.
That's interesting. So basically you're saying that you try to articulate as much of it as possible, codify it so that it's also easy to transfer from one to the other.
Yeah.
Because culture is generally seen as something that's non-codifiable. It's not articulate. But yeah, interesting. Yeah. And for training, do you have in-house trainers or do you bring trainers from outside for your fellows?
Both. So we have a very active full-time training team and support team in-house. So they will like run the bulk of our training institute, etc. And then they will bring in a lot of experts into our training program as well. So our fellows get a really nice blend of our own growing, like learning each year, but also like fresh ideas from outside.
So it's so you also got, I mean, you met Wendy Kopp and that's how you started the Teach for India, as a breakout of the Teach for America. So what's the relationship there? Are you you learn from each other? Are you still connected or is it?
Yeah. So actually, Wendy, when we were starting Teach for India, Wendy was starting a global network called Teach for All. And so today there are 64 countries similar to Teach for India who are all independent entities. So we have our own boards, our own fundraising, do our own work, but we're bound by certain unifying principles that we all believe very deeply in. And there's a lot of very well curated cross-learning that happens at multiple levels of the organization. So we meet very often, we travel to each other's countries. Our functional heads meet to exchange ideas. So really, it's a very active learning network.
Very nice. And so among the other 63 other countries, which one runs at the scale that you run?
Yeah, so really Teach for America was the first program, which started, I guess, 35 odd years ago. So it's got more time than the rest of us. And that still remains the largest program. It was then replicated in the UK as Teach First, which I think Teach First is maybe a little bit bigger than Teach for India. I think Teach for India would be the third largest in the network. Yeah.
I see. Okay. And all of them have the same model, similar model?
Yeah. So there's lots of like adaptations.
Of course.
To how we do things. But the idea of like recruiting top talent, having them teach for 2 years in an environment with kids from low-income backgrounds, an alumni movement, rigorous like evaluation, strong training and support. These aspects you'll find across all.
Okay. Okay. Very nice. All right. That's nice. So also, I think one of your other identities is that you started Akanksha. When you were 18, right? When you came back from, when you dropped out of Tufts and you started studying at Xavier College and all of that. So what's happening with Akanksha today? And what's the relationship between these two organizations?
Yeah, I mean, so Akanksha today, Touchwood, is just doing really, really well. It's also led by Saurabh Taneja, who was a Teach for India fellow from our first cohort, who's now the CEO of Akanksha. So another full circle there. Akanksha has doubled down on running schools, but they also do some work at pretty significant scale within the government school system, spreading some of their programs. So Akanksha always had a very strong art program, for example, which they've spread to hundreds of schools now as well. The relationship between the two, I mean, we have some common trustees, so we're constantly talking to each other. And we also place some of our Teach for India fellows within Akanksha schools. So that's another connection. And then just a lot of thought partnership at the leadership level amongst us and Akanksha and many of our other alumni organizations, where we're constantly reaching out to each other for support, for ideas. When we have challenges, we come together. So that's been very special.
So Akanksha runs its own schools?
So Akanksha partners with the government to run public-private partnership schools. So the building belongs to the government. The children come in by lottery. And then Akanksha runs the whole school, by which I mean They hire the teachers, they hire the HM, and they run the whole school. So it really is a very strong partnership between the government and Akanksha.
I see. And you mentioned that art program has been a big part. And I think you also have Maya Musical.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what was the origin of bringing some of these programs into the school program? Of course, they make a lot of sense, but not very often we hear about it.
I mean, honestly, I think one is I have a very soft corner in my heart for the arts. I think I grew up playing piano and having exposure to a lot of theater and music and dance. And when I started my own work with children, I found that the arts was an extremely powerful, if not the most powerful way to help children raise their voice, express themselves, understand who they are. And so I felt it was a very powerful medium in education very early on as a young teacher myself. And then that really grew at Akanksha. So we started a very strong visual arts program. And then we got into theater arts. So I've actually, like Maya, I've worked now on 7 musicals across both organizations. And the arts has never been just like the technique of making art, but really using art to help children go through a very reflective, deep journey of understanding a concept or a value very deeply. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we worked on a musical called The Conference of the Birds. And the idea of that journey was to take children on a 2-year journey to explore the idea of India and the values enshrined in the preamble of our constitution. And where do we see around us equality? Where do we not see liberty? And so it culminated in a musical, but the larger idea was this idea that our nation is built in our classrooms. And so if our children grow up compassionate, our country and our world is going to be more compassionate.
Interesting. Yeah. So, let me ask this question about TFI's ultimate vision, and I guess Akanksha as well, is educational equity for every child in India. What would a fully realized version of that vision look like to you? What role do you think TFI plays in it versus the roles that government, communities, and other actors that play?
Yeah. So, I often say this, that when I was much younger, I really believed that I could do very great things. And as I got older and a little bit wiser, that dream got closer and closer to me. And now I think really my belief is that our responsibility, or my responsibility, is just to keep working on myself, and then whatever ripples will ripple. So I say that because I think as I've realized how complex the world is, I've also grown in my own humility and understanding that we just have to work together with so many others towards our vision. Our vision, if educational equity is achieved and every child gets an excellent education, I think we will play a significant role in reaching a vision of an India free of poverty and filled with love. For me, that's the reason to change the education system. And I guess when I see a vision at that level of largeness and importance, the answer is just everyone has to work towards it, right? And that is what the government works towards, and civil society. I think Teach for India's unique vantage point, or our contribution to it, is the investment in talent towards that. The idea that leaders really, really matter. I mean, it seems like such an obvious point, but in the sector, I found we tend to focus a lot on programs, on products, but not on this idea that the real multiplier is the leader, right? Where you see, and we have so many examples of this across the world today, where you see a bad leader, you see the damage that they are able to do. And where you see a great leader, you see the power of what that leader can do. And so I think our bet has just been on focusing deep on leadership and hoping that ripples towards that vision of an India free of poverty and filled with love.
I really hope that happens, and that's what one would like to see. Also, you said something that's very interesting, and that's about that you work more on yourself now, and that will hopefully create its own ripples. And that's often something that a lot of leaders may instinctively know but not really focus on, and we keep focusing on outside rather than the self. So would you like to speak a little bit more on why as a leader should one really focus on the self more than just the outside?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like really honestly, like everything I practice and I've tried has been a function of like what I've seen others do. And for me, I spent a lot of time over the years in Ahmedabad in an ecosystem called Service Space, where just people did things and believed things that felt very different from a younger me. So where I believed a lot in outcomes, they would talk about planting seeds and not worrying about where the seeds went. Where I was looking for like the big fast way to get to a goal, they were talking about like small acts with a lot of love. And at first it felt very disorienting, but the more I saw the impact that they were able to have without like focusing on that being a goal, the more I started realizing the power of that. And then over time, even logically, I shifted because I said, really, like millions of people doing small things is always going to be bigger, more sustainable than a few people doing big things, And I feel the whole construct of leadership has shifted in the world from the sort of very charismatic front of the room, like one leader everyone follows of the past. Great leaders, those were, to like, I think enabled by technology, learning from how nature operates, this many to many form of leadership, right? Where sometimes we step forward, sometimes we hold the back of a room, but most often leadership is just flowing this way and it's not flowing from one person to many. I think I was just blessed to observe a lot of those leaders around me, and something very strongly resonated with that. And I began to see counterintuitively that the more I focused on small things, the more seemed to happen. The more I like focused on controlling myself, my own emotions, the way I see the world, the more the things around me shifted. And so I think it's just small steps, and honestly, not even all small steps forward. Still, there are many days when I'm going backwards, but it's empowering, because when you focus a lot on things outside of you, you actually don't have control. Like all I can do in this conversation is share as authentically as I can my views, but I have no control over what you're thinking, what you're going to take away, what question you're going to ask me next. Like, so for me to worry about that feels like a waste of energy. When I turn all of that towards myself, it enables me to do more to shift myself.
So Shaheen, will now move to you as the leader. And I just want to ask for you that what keeps you motivated? You've been doing this for over 3 decades and you've had a long arc of work. So what keeps you motivated, and what have been some of your lows and highs in doing this work?
I love children. Honestly, that's what's kept me here. That's what brought me in. I still continue to teach once a week. That is my most favorite day of the week. And I'm actually teaching a class now of grade 7 and 8 children. And we're exploring over 2 years the value of love and what that looks like in the world. So I think going back to class every week, and at different stages, I've worked with different groups of children, but I've always worked with one group of children deeply. And I think it's really reminded me of why I do this work, which I think is that I feel like human potential determines where the world goes, and that starts with children. And when I see what kids are capable of and what a teacher can unleash, it gives me a lot of motivation to keep going. So I think that's my main reason. The other reason is I just over time have come to believe a lot in people and the goodness within people. I've been so lucky to work with just so many incredible people. And in a world where the news feels increasingly overwhelming, it often feels like the world is on fire. Just knowing that I work alongside a group of people who every day are waking up trying to do good things for the people around them and the world, I think that keeps me anchored. So yeah, I think those are the main reasons. There are a lot of bad days. but they're never bad enough to question what I'm doing or why I'm here. They're more like, yeah, it's a bad day. Tomorrow will be a better day.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So in a way, I think you have hit the nail by saying that, there is this, that children, when they feel loved and safe, their defenses come down and then they're open to learning, right?
Yeah.
And so that whole thing of like, if I'm always in a fight or flight mode, then I'm not ever going to reach my potential. I'm always going to be in this state of survival. And I think what you do with trying to create love and safety for children is very important. Is that a message that you also are able to, share with your own fellows and teachers?
I mean, I think this idea of leading with love is the most important message that I'm trying to amplify in every possible way. So I do sessions with fellows on it. I'm also in very early stages of writing a book called The Pedagogy of Love, which aims to break down love, move it away from being this fluffy concept to saying like the little actions you take in a classroom make kids feel, what the things you shared, safe and like they belong and like they can be challenged with care. I think the single most consistent thing I've seen across these 36 years of work in classrooms that have been high performing has been the presence of love. And so I have a lot of energy, probably more energy than anything else right now, to spread that particular idea. And I think it changes the way you feel as a teacher about teaching. Like, when you're giving love and receiving love, I mean, your whole classroom becomes a space of healing, of joy, of, the acceptance and almost valuing of mistakes and failure, the understanding that we need to accept each other for our beings first. I mean, just so many concepts come alive when you explore that question as a teacher.
Could you give us one example of where you've really seen this in action, like a story or something that really stands out for you?
Yeah. I mean, I'll talk about during the Maya musical journey, I worked with a group of students and we took them to do a lot of service-related activities. And one day we took them in Mumbai. There's a old age home, and most of the people who live in that home have amputated limbs. And we took our children there, and we said, okay, we have a challenge for you. Just go for 90 minutes and interact with one of these people, and then just come back and let's talk about it. And so one of our students went and she was talking to an old lady in the home. And, I was watching them from far and there was a lot of hand movements, a lot of laughter. And then when I got a bit closer, I realized, ironically, that neither of them spoke the same language. And so I thought, this is strange. I said, let me give it 3 or 4 minutes and then she'll probably move like I would to another person where she has common language. But for 90 minutes, this continued with this interaction. Wow. And this student was 13 years old. And then she came back afterwards and we did a debrief. And I said, Priyanka, I said, what were you talking about? And why did you continue to engage? And she looked at me and she said, Didi, she said, I learned something today. I learned that you can communicate beyond language. And to me, that was such a moment of love and understanding, like empathy and, how many dimensions there are to connection that go beyond language. There's so many stories like that. And I think stories of, I can tell you a story from yesterday that has really touched my heart. I did a call with some teachers yesterday evening, and one of them shared how she hated her school life, her own school life years ago. And I said, why? And she said, because she had boils on her body. And her teacher made her almost feel like she was diseased, So her teacher wouldn't let anyone sit next to her, play with her. She was ostracized by everybody. So she has horrible memories of school. And she said she left school thinking, I never want to be a teacher. And then somehow years later, she landed up at Teach for India. And ironically, got a student who had the same boils on her hand. This girl, Madisha. And this fellow said, her boils were so painful on her hand that she couldn't eat. And so what she would do is at lunchtime, the teacher would take this child's dabba and make bites and feed the child bite by bite. And she tells the story of how that shifted the child's life forever. That simple act of feeding that child. It's often not anything big and dramatic. It's these small things done when you don't expect them. Yeah. So many, many stories like that.
Very interesting. So when you look back over the 3 decades that you've been working, do you have any regrets? Do you have anything that you would do differently now with the benefit of hindsight?
I mean, I have no regrets because I think that, you almost need to go through the journey to get to the learnings that you have. And at the same time, there's so many things that I have learned in the last 5-10 years that I feel like, gosh, I wish I had known those as a younger person. So, I feel like I had to go through that journey to get there, but I do think it would have shifted, like even the focus on like the belief that like I could do so much versus today feeling much smaller in the world. Like the collective matters so much. Working with others matters so much. As a young person, I just wanted to do everything myself. I wanted to be in control. Today, I want to learn to let go of control. So there have been like lots of shifts in my journey that sometimes I wonder, like if I had had those insights as a much younger person, even this idea of holding the gray and the and in the world, I think I was a much more like black and white person. I used to believe a lot in wrong and right. And today I'm like, it's so much more nuanced and complex than that. I believe a lot more today in just embracing being human. And being human, when I say that, I mean just being flawed and, knowing that every day there are things we could have done better, and that's okay, So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. But
very nice. That's very nice because I think it's so important for people with your kind of achievements to still talk about the fact that, we're not perfect. We're not perfect because there's so much focus on that at this point of time, to look perfect and to be perfect. And that's not possible at all. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that's very, very powerful. Just wanted to, your principal at Xavier College, Principal D'Souza, I think he gave you admission saying that you will go and, you promised to do something for India. Have you been in touch with him, and how does he think of you?
I mean, I haven't been in touch with him for a long time, but I think I never forgot that commitment to him. To me, it was less important of whether he saw that and more important that like I lived out that commitment. I took that privilege that he gave me because I didn't get into Xavier's through the normal admission process. I got in because he very kindly gave me I think he had 5 seats to give to sort of outlier students, and I guess I was in that category for him. And so I took that commitment and promise very, very seriously.
Mm-hmm. But in a way, he also did what you do for your children, right? You made them loved, he made you feel special and gave you the opportunity. So that was lovely.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe just because I started crying in his office and he felt sorry for me, but
whichever. All right. So succession planning is a known vulnerability in the Indian social sector. So at TFI, you're the founding CEO, and I wish you continue to do a lot of work as you go along. But have you thought about succession planning, and how do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, very actively, actually. And I think these are the things I feel very lucky to have a board that really keeps me focused on all of these issues. I feel very not worried about succession at TFI because I guess we're in the business of building leadership, and I feel we have so many. I mean, I feel so blessed to work with the team that I work with. And I think, I could already see a handful of people taking this on, and each one would have their own unique strengths and take the organization in a different direction. But I feel lucky to have worked with a handful of people that I think have really grown up in TFI over the last 10, 12, 15 years, even alongside me. And so we think about it actively. We actually have a whole succession planning document in place, like we present it to the HR subcommittee. But more than that, I think it's just the belief that we have really good people inside who will take it forward. Like they believe it in their hearts. They own this mission. I feel very sure about that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So finally, I think for the listeners, there must be some who want to make a change in their careers or are at a stage where they're making choices for where they want their career to go. So both young and people in jobs. What would be some of things that you would tell them based on your experience?
Great question. I mean, firstly, I would say come. Don't overthink it. Just jump in and come. I think... sometimes it's just like the most important thing you can do is take that first step. I would say like a good starting point, especially if you're coming from a different sector, is however much experience and however successful you are, to know that this is a completely different world. And so I would say start by doing something that makes you really proximate to the ground. You know, in our case, because we work in education, some direct work with children or with teachers on the ground, understanding the complexity, the nuance, the emotional drain of what it means to drive change on the ground. I think that feels like a very good starting point. And then post that and building that context and that understanding, trying to find the sweet spot between the skills that you bring and the context that you've arrived within.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you, Shaheen, and we wish you all the best for the work that you do, and hopefully this message and the conversation will inspire people, give ideas as to how to lead organizations like this. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's always a real privilege to have space to step back and think about the journey, and just really appreciate it. Thank you so much.